Goodfellas is a masterpiece. It is also, by necessity, a version of events shaped by one man's memory, one director's eye, and the requirements of a 2.5-hour runtime. Henry Hill got to be the narrator of his own life. The people buried in the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist did not. What actually happened, across 60 years of omertà cracking open, of bosses flipping on bosses, of FBI agents becoming more criminal than the criminals they were managing, is more complicated, more consequential, and, in several cases, significantly darker than what any film has shown. The men on this list were not anti-heroes with good instincts who made bad choices. They were career criminals who cooperated with the government when the mathematics of their own survival made it the only rational option left. Some of them went back to crime the moment the pressure was off. One of them refused every exit offered and paid for that refusal with his life. This is the real story. It starts in 1963 in a Washington Senate chamber with a man who had nowhere left to run. Section 1. Joseph Valachi, the first crack in the wall, 1963. September 25, 1963, Washington, D.C. A short, stocky man in his late 50s sat down in front of a packed Senate chamber, television cameras pointed at his face, and did something no member of the American Mafia had ever done before. He opened his mouth and started talking. His name was Joseph Michael Valachi. He was a low-ranking soldier in the Genovese crime family. Not a boss, not a captain, not even particularly important in the grand scheme of things. But what he knew and what he was about to say out loud would permanently change organized crime in America. Before Valachi sat down in that Senate chamber, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially maintained that a national organized crime network did not exist. J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful law enforcement figure in the country, had spent decades insisting there was no such thing as the Mafia. Local gangs, sure. Criminal enterprises, yes. But a unified, structured, nationwide organization with its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own courts, and its own death sentences? Hoover said no. The idea was a myth, he claimed, a fantasy. Valachi proved him wrong in front of the entire country. The story of how Valachi ended up in that chair begins in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1962. He was serving a 15-year sentence for narcotics trafficking when Vito Genovese, the boss of his own crime family and a fellow prisoner, became convinced that Valachi was secretly feeding information to federal prosecutors. That suspicion was enough. In the world Valachi lived in, a suspected informant was a dead informant. Genovese gave Valachi what was known inside the organization as the kiss of death. A signal, delivered in person, that the order had been given to have him eliminated. Valachi was now a marked man inside a federal prison, surrounded by people who wanted him dead, with nowhere to run. He became paranoid, watching every face, trying to figure out which prisoner had been assigned to carry out the contract on his life. On June 22, 1962, he spotted a man approaching him in the prison yard and became convinced this was the hired killer. He grabbed a metal pipe and struck the man, killing him. The man turned out to be an entirely innocent fellow prisoner named John Sopp, who had nothing to do with the Mafia. Valachi now faced the death penalty for murder on top of his existing sentence, with a contract still active on his life. He had no good options left. He contacted federal narcotics agents and eventually the FBI and offered them everything he had. The Kennedy Justice Department, which had been aggressively targeting organized crime, immediately recognized what they had and moved to put Valachi in front of the Senate. What followed over 11 days of televised hearings was the most detailed public account of the American Mafia that had ever been given. Valachi had been a member since 1930, and his memory was extraordinary. He described the initiation ceremony in precise detail: the pricked finger, the burning piece of paper passed between the hands, the oath sworn on the blood. He named the 5 major crime families operating out of New York City and identified their bosses. He explained the chain of command from soldier to captain to underboss to boss. He described the ruling commission that sat above all the families and settled disputes between them. He also revealed that members never used the word Mafia among themselves. The organization called itself Cosa Nostra, which translates from Italian as our thing. This was the first time most Americans had ever heard that phrase. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who testified before Valachi at the same hearings, called the testimony the biggest single intelligence breakthrough yet in fighting organized crime in the United States. Police commissioners from Chicago, Tampa, Detroit, and Buffalo each came forward to confirm that what Valachi described matched exactly what their own departments had been observing for years without being able to prove. The institutional consequences were immediate and lasting. Within a few years, Congress passed legislation authorizing court-ordered wiretapping that had previously been off-limits. A formal federal witness protection program was created specifically to handle people like Valachi, individuals willing to testify against organized crime in exchange for a new identity and relocation. And in 1970, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, became law. RICO was a legal tool that allowed prosecutors to go after the leadership of a criminal organization, even when those leaders had not personally committed the specific crimes being charged. It was the single most devastating legal weapon ever deployed against the Mafia, and it was born directly from the gap that Valachi's testimony exposed. Valachi himself received no dramatic reward for what he did. He was transferred between federal facilities, eventually ending up at a penitentiary in La Tuna, Texas, where the government gave him what was described as comfortable accommodations. There was a $100,000 contract on his life placed by the Mafia that remained active until the day he died. He died in that prison on April 3, 1971, of a heart attack, having never breathed free air again. He had never been a boss. He had never ordered anyone eliminated, at least not in any capacity that the Senate hearings addressed. He was, by his own description, a street-level soldier who spent 30 years doing what he was told. But the information stored in his memory turned out to be worth more to the United States government than anything any individual crime boss had ever possessed. Because Valachi did not just give them names, he gave them a map. Every informant who came after him, every cooperating witness, every turned captain, every boss who eventually decided that a deal was better than a sentence, stepped through the door that Joseph Valachi opened in that Senate chamber in September 1963. But Valachi was a soldier, a foot soldier with extraordinary knowledge, but still someone who operated at the edges of real power. The men who would follow him into cooperation with the government were different. Some of them had planned operations, ordered eliminations, and run entire criminal empires. One of them helped pull off what was, at the time, the largest cash theft in American history, and then watched his crew get eliminated one by one until he had no choice but to become the very thing they feared most. Section 2. Henry Hill and the Lufthansa Heist. The real Goodfellas story. Henry Hill was never a made man. He could not be. His father was Irish, and the rules of the American Mafia were absolute on the subject. Only men of full Italian descent could be formally inducted into the organization. No matter how much money he made, no matter how many years he put in, no matter how loyal he was, Hill would always be an associate. A useful one, a trusted one, but permanently on the outside of the door that mattered most. That exclusion would eventually cost the Lucchese crime family everything. Hill grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, the son of an Irish electrician and a Sicilian mother. From the time he was a child, he watched the men across the street from his family's home, the ones in the good suits, who never seemed to work normal jobs, who were respected and feared in equal measure, and decided that was the life he wanted. By the time he was in his mid-teens, he was running errands for Paul Vario, a Lucchese family captain who would become his mentor and the closest thing Hill ever had to a patron inside the organization. He dropped out of school entirely. His father beat him for it. The mobsters celebrated it. For the next 2 decades, Hill operated as a Lucchese associate, involved in hijacking, loan sharking, extortion, and eventually narcotics, which the family officially prohibited, but which Hill pursued anyway because the money was too large to ignore. He became close to James Burke, an Irish-American like himself who ran his own crew of thieves and who could not be made for the same reasons Hill could not. Burke was known inside the organization as Jimmy the Gent, partly for his generosity when things went well, and partly because the nickname obscured what he actually was underneath it: one of the most dangerous men in New York. In the summer of 1978, a piece of information made its way through several sets of hands before reaching Burke. It started with a man named Louis Werner, an employee at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Werner had a serious gambling problem and owed $20,000 to his bookie, Martin Krugman. To settle the debt, Werner offered something more valuable than money. He told Krugman that Lufthansa regularly flew large amounts of cash into its cargo terminal, foreign currency from American military personnel and tourists stationed in West Germany, and that the security arrangements at the terminal had significant gaps he knew how to exploit. Krugman passed the information to Hill. Hill passed it to Burke. Burke brought the plan to Vario, who approved it. The planning took months. Werner provided floor plans of the cargo warehouse, explained exactly how the security system functioned, identified which employees had access to which areas, and confirmed the schedule of incoming shipments. Burke assembled a crew, and they rehearsed the operation out of his restaurant in the Ozone Park neighborhood of Queens. On December 11, 1978, the crew moved. 6 armed men entered the Lufthansa cargo building before dawn, took the employees on site as hostages, and worked through the vault systematically. The operation lasted 64 minutes. When they left, they took $5 million in untraceable cash and $875,000 in jewelry. It was the largest cash theft committed on American soil at that point in history. The robbery itself went almost perfectly. What came after did not. One member of the crew, a man named Parnell Edwards, was supposed to drive the getaway vehicle to New Jersey to have it destroyed at a salvage yard. Instead, he parked it in front of his apartment building, directly in front of a fire hydrant, where police found it 2 days later. His fingerprints were inside. The FBI had the Burke crew identified within 72 hours of the theft. Burke became convinced that the only way to protect himself was to eliminate everyone who could connect him to the operation. What followed over the next several months was a sequence of disappearances and discovered remains that investigators would spend decades piecing together. Krugman, the bookie who had brought the original tip, was demanding a large cut of the proceeds and complaining loudly about it. He vanished in January 1979. Richard Eaton, who had been involved in a separate scheme with Burke and had stolen from him, was found in a freezer truck in February 1979. Edwards, whose parking error had triggered everything, was found in his apartment, eliminated by 2 members of the crew who had been sent to handle him. One by one, the people who could identify Burke's role in the heist stopped being alive. Hill was watching all of this from the edges, increasingly aware that his own position was not safe. Burke had already shown he was willing to eliminate anyone who represented a potential problem, and Hill had started dealing narcotics heavily, a violation that Vario had specifically warned him against. In 1980, narcotics investigators arrested Hill while he was preparing a drug transaction in Pittsburgh. The FBI immediately recognized him as a Lucchese associate and brought him in as a material witness in the Lufthansa investigation. Hill understood his situation with complete clarity. Burke had been systematically removing everyone connected to the heist. A narcotics conviction would send Hill to prison, where Burke's reach was still very much operational. On May 27, 1980, Hill signed a cooperation agreement with the Brooklyn Organized Crime Strike Force. He gave the government everything: the heist, the subsequent eliminations, the narcotics operation, a Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme that Burke had organized, and decades of Lucchese family criminal activity. His testimony produced 50 convictions. Vario was imprisoned for extortion and died behind bars in 1989. Burke was convicted for his role in the basketball scandal and later for one of the post-heist eliminations and died in prison in 1996. The cash and jewelry from the Lufthansa terminal were never recovered. Hill entered the witness protection program with his wife and 2 children, was relocated under a new identity, and was removed from the program in 1987 after repeatedly violating its conditions. He spent the rest of his life openly trading on his story. He died in 2012. The man who ratted on the crew was the only one from that world who died of natural causes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Hill was an associate, someone who was always adjacent to the center of power, never inside it. The next man on this list was different. He was not on the edges. He was the second most powerful figure in the most powerful crime family in New York, a man who had participated in 19 separate eliminations, who sat beside his boss and watched the head of the entire organization get taken out on a Manhattan street, and then, years later, decided his own boss had made him expendable. Section 3. Sammy the Bull Gravano. 19 murders for 5 years. Salvatore Gravano was born in 1945 in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a neighborhood so thoroughly connected to the Gambino crime family that the organization was practically part of the local infrastructure. As a child, a relative once remarked that he looked exactly like his uncle Sammy, and the nickname stuck. From that point forward, almost nobody called him Salvatore. He was Sammy. Later, when his reputation inside the organization had grown to a particular kind of frightening, they would call him Sammy the Bull. He rose through the Gambino family across the 1960s and 1970s, moving from street-level criminal work into increasingly serious roles. He was not a large man physically, but his reputation for being willing to handle violence personally, not just to order it, but to participate in it directly, made him someone the family valued in a specific way. By the late 1980s, John Gotti had elevated him all the way to underboss, the second highest position in the entire Gambino organization. In the hierarchy of the 5 New York families, that made Gravano one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. The relationship between Gravano and Gotti had been built over years of shared criminal enterprise and mutual benefit. When Gotti decided in December 1985 to remove Paul Castellano, the sitting boss of the Gambino family, Gravano was part of the planning. On the evening of December 16, 1985, Castellano and his driver, Thomas Valachi, were taken out in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Gotti and Gravano sat in a car nearby and watched the result as it happened. Gotti then installed himself as boss of the Gambino family, and Gravano's position within the organization rose with him. For several years, the partnership functioned. Gravano ran construction industry operations for the family, accumulated significant money, and served as the organizational muscle behind Gotti's more public-facing leadership. Gotti liked attention and press coverage in a way that made more cautious figures inside the organization deeply uncomfortable. Gravano was the operational counterweight, the one who kept the machinery running while Gotti cultivated his image. Then the FBI planted listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, which Gotti used as a regular meeting location. The recordings captured conversations across 1989 and 1990. In December 1989, the devices recorded Gotti speaking about Gravano with an associate, describing him as someone who kept creating new companies without permission and overstepping his boundaries. More damaging than the criticism itself was what else the recordings contained. Gotti discussing his intention to frame Gravano as the primary organizer behind several specific eliminations if the case went to trial. Gotti was, in plain terms, preparing to use his own underboss as a shield. In December 1990, FBI agents arrested both men. They were charged together under the federal racketeering statute. Once in custody, the FBI made a calculated decision. They played the Ravenite recordings for Gravano directly, specifically the portions in which Gotti discussed setting him up to take the weight for crimes they had committed together. Gravano's first approach to the government came through an unusual channel. His wife, Deborah, contacted the prosecution team and indicated that Gravano was willing to discuss cooperation, but only under specific conditions. The lead prosecutor, John Gleason, met with Deborah Gravano and laid out the reality plainly. Gravano was a man who had participated in multiple eliminations, and there was no version of any deal that included immunity. The best available outcome was a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for complete cooperation and truthful testimony. On November 13, 1991, Gravano formally agreed to become a government witness. He was the first member of the upper hierarchy of a New York crime family to do so. The information he provided covered not just Gotti, but the broader operations of the Gambino family across decades. Eliminations, racketeering, construction industry extortion, jury tampering, and the internal politics of the organization at the highest levels. The trial of John Gotti and consigliere Frank Locascio began in early 1992. Gravano took the witness stand and testified for 9 days. He described in detail 19 separate instances of fatal violence in which he had been personally involved, sometimes as the organizer, sometimes as a direct participant, sometimes in a supporting role. He confirmed Gotti's involvement in 10 of those instances, including the Castellano elimination that had made Gotti boss. The jury convicted Gotti on all counts in April 1992. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of release, and died there in 2002. Gravano's sentence for his cooperation was 5 years. Because he had already served approximately 4 years in custody during the investigation and trial period, he was released after serving less than 1 additional year. He then entered the Witness Protection Program and was relocated to Arizona under a new identity. The families of the people Gravano had been involved in eliminating were left to process this arrangement as best they could. Laura Garofalo, whose father, Eddie Garofalo, had been among those Gravano admitted involvement in removing in 1990, stated publicly that the deal represented a fundamental failure of the system to account for the people on the other side of these transactions. The arrangement did not hold. By the late 1990s, Gravano had rebuilt a criminal operation in Arizona, this time centered on the distribution of the synthetic drug ecstasy. His organization was moving tens of thousands of tablets and generating substantial revenue weekly. In February 2000, law enforcement arrested Gravano, along with approximately 40 other individuals connected to the ring, including his son Gerard, his daughter Karen, and his ex-wife Deborah. The investigation that brought him down relied in significant part on informants inside his own drug network, people who cooperated with law enforcement in exchange for reduced consequences. The man who destroyed John Gotti by becoming a government witness was himself destroyed by people who made the same calculation about him. Gravano served nearly 2 decades in Arizona State Prison on the drug conviction and was released in 2017. He has since become a public figure, appearing in interviews and running a podcast. What his case permanently established was a question that every subsequent prosecutor dealing with high-value criminal witnesses would have to answer honestly. How much past violence is an acceptable trade for future convictions? There is no clean answer to that question, and the families who buried people that Gravano admitted involvement in removing understood that better than anyone. Gravano was dangerous and calculating, but he was still ultimately a subordinate. The next figure on this list operated at an entirely different level. A man who spent years building the most carefully protected criminal organization in New York, who made his soldiers refer to him by tugging their ears rather than speaking his name aloud, and who still, in the end, made the same choice Gravano had made when the alternative became unacceptable. Section 4. Whitey Bulger, the informant who used the FBI as a weapon. James Bulger grew up in the Old Harbor housing project in South Boston, the same block as a boy named John Connolly. Connolly was several years younger, and as a child, he looked up to Bulger the way kids in that neighborhood looked up to anyone who commanded respect on the street. Bulger was already running with gangs by his late teens. Connolly went to Boston College, joined the FBI, and built a career. Their paths diverged completely, until 1975, when Connolly deliberately brought them back together. By the mid-1970s, Connolly had been transferred to the FBI's Boston field office and was working organized crime cases. The Bureau's primary target in New England was the Patriarca crime family, the Italian-American organization that controlled criminal operations across the region. Connolly's idea was straightforward: use Bulger, who by then led the Winter Hill Gang and had his own reasons to want the Italian mob weakened, as a source of inside information against the Patriarchas. In the fall of 1975, Connolly met Bulger privately and made his pitch. Bulger agreed, but set one condition before signing on. He would not be called an informant. He would be, in his own description, a strategist. The distinction was entirely cosmetic, but it mattered to Bulger personally. In the world he inhabited, being a rat was the worst thing a person could be. He had built his entire public identity around being the opposite of that. The arrangement began anyway, and it would last for 15 years. What developed was not the standard informant relationship the FBI's guidelines were designed to govern. Bulger was feeding the Bureau information, yes, but specifically information about rivals he wanted removed from the playing field. The Patriarcha family members he identified were real targets committing real crimes, and the cases built against them were legitimate. But the information Bulger chose to share was filtered entirely through what benefited his own operation. He was not helping the FBI. He was using the FBI as an instrument to eliminate competition while his own organization operated without interference. Connolly's protection was concrete and specific. He removed Bulger's name from indictments. In 1979, federal prosecutors were building a case against multiple members of the Winter Hill Gang for fixing horse races. Bulger and his associate Stephen Flemmi were originally included. Connolly and his supervisor John Morris persuaded the lead prosecutor to drop both men from the indictment. The case proceeded without them. Howie Winter, the previous Winter Hill boss, went to prison. Bulger, cleared of the charges, took over as the unquestioned leader of the gang. Connolly also passed Bulger the identities of people who were cooperating with law enforcement against him. This was not a minor administrative failure. When Bulger received those names, those individuals faced lethal consequences. Bulger would arrange meetings with suspected informants, and they would not leave those meetings alive. The FBI was, without intending the full scope of what it was enabling, providing operational intelligence that Bulger used to protect himself through violence. Bulger paid Connolly over $235,000 across the course of their relationship. Connolly accepted dinners, cash, and other benefits from Bulger and Flemmi. His supervisor, John Morris, also accepted money and had Bulger purchase airline tickets for Morris's girlfriend. The corruption was not limited to one agent operating in isolation. In 1994, Connolly received information that law enforcement was preparing to move against Bulger with a formal indictment. He passed that warning directly to Bulger. Bulger disappeared. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and spent the next 16 years as a fugitive, eventually located in a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica, California in 2011. He was living there with his longtime companion under false identities. At trial in 2013, a jury found Bulger guilty of participating in 11 fatal incidents as part of a broader racketeering conviction covering decades of criminal activity. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. In October 2018, less than 12 hours after being transferred to a federal prison in West Virginia, Bulger was found beaten to death in his cell. He was 89 years old. Investigators identified 2 Massachusetts organized crime figures as suspects. No charges were filed. Connolly was convicted of racketeering and obstruction of justice in 2002. In 2008, a Florida jury convicted him of second-degree homicide for his role in the death of John Callahan, a businessman who had information about Bulger's criminal activities and was eliminated after Connolly alerted Bulger that federal investigators were closing in on Callahan. Connolly was sentenced to 40 years in Florida State Prison and was released on medical grounds in 2021. The Bulger case permanently exposed something the FBI preferred not to examine publicly: that the institutional incentives built around developing high-level informants had created conditions where an agent's career advancement depended on protecting sources who were actively causing serious harm. Connolly was convicted. His supervisors were not. What makes the next case different from everything covered so far is geography and scale. The man at the center of it was not operating in one American city. He was simultaneously dismantling organizations on 2 continents, testifying in the longest criminal trial in United States history at that point, and providing the evidence that put hundreds of people behind bars across Italy and America, all while the organization he had betrayed was eliminating members of his own family, one by one, in retaliation. Section 5. Tommaso Buscetta, the Mafia War that broke the silence. Tommaso Buscetta was born in 1928 in Palermo, Sicily, the youngest of 17 children in a poor family living in one of the city's most difficult neighborhoods. He joined the Sicilian Mafia in 1945 at 17 years old, beginning with cigarette smuggling before moving into more serious criminal work. Over the following decades, he became a respected and well-connected figure inside Cosa Nostra. Not a boss, but someone with relationships that crossed family lines and extended from Sicily to the United States to South America. He was not the most powerful man in the Sicilian Mafia. What made him historically significant was not his rank, but his decision, made in 1984 inside an Italian prison, to tell everything he knew to a judge named Giovanni Falcone. To understand why Buscetta made that decision, you have to understand what the Sicilian Mafia did to itself in the early 1980s. The organization went through what was called the Second Mafia War, a brutal internal conflict driven by Salvatore Riina, the boss of the Corleonesi clan, who moved systematically to eliminate rival factions and consolidate total control over Cosa Nostra. The war was not like previous internal disputes. Rina did not just target rival bosses. He eliminated entire networks, the allies of his enemies, the families of his enemies, anyone whose loyalty was even questionable. Buscetta's world was destroyed in this period. His 2 adult sons were among those taken. His brother-in-law, 4 of his nephews, and numerous close allies were also eliminated. The organization he had sworn loyalty to in 1945 had consumed his entire family. He fled to Brazil, was arrested there in October 1983, and was extradited back to Italy in June 1984. In Italian custody, facing prison, with most of the people he cared about already gone, Buscetta attempted to take his own life by consuming a large quantity of barbiturates. The attempt failed. After surviving it, he made a different calculation. He asked to speak with Giovanni Falcone. Falcone was an anti-mafia magistrate working in Palermo who had spent years building cases against Cosa Nostra with limited success, partly because the organization's code of silence, omertà, made obtaining inside testimony nearly impossible. When word came that Buscetta wanted to talk, Falcone traveled to meet him immediately. What followed were 45 days of continuous interviews. Buscetta explained the complete internal structure of the Sicilian Mafia, the territorial divisions, the hierarchy within each family, the function of the Sicilian Commission that sat above the families and governed disputes between them, and the initiation rituals that bound members to the organization. He explained the rules of Cosa Nostra as they had been established and passed down orally across generations, never written anywhere. He gave Falcone the conceptual and organizational framework needed to prosecute the leadership of the Sicilian Mafia as a unified criminal structure rather than as a collection of individual criminals. This framework became known as the Buscetta theorem. It allowed prosecutors to argue that the leaders of Cosa Nostra were legally responsible for crimes committed to benefit the organization, even when those leaders had not personally carried out the specific acts being charged. It was the Sicilian legal equivalent of what RICO had made possible in America. In December 1984, Buscetta was extradited to the United States, where the government gave him a new identity, American citizenship, and placement in the Witness Protection Program. He then testified in the Pizza Connection trial in New York, a case that exposed a network using pizza restaurant storefronts across America to distribute heroin imported from Southwest Asia. The trial, which lasted from September 1985 to March 1987, was the longest federal criminal trial in American history at that point, and ended with 18 convictions. Back in Italy, Buscetta's testimony was central to the Maxi trial, which began in Palermo in 1986. The scale of the proceeding was unlike anything the Italian justice system had previously attempted. The court had to construct a purpose-built bunker facility inside the Palermo prison complex to accommodate the proceedings. Of 475 mafia members and associates formally indicted, 338 were convicted. Those convictions were upheld by Italy's highest court in 1992. Buscetta had refused, throughout the 1980s, to discuss the political connections between Cosa Nostra and Italian government figures. He stated that the Italian state was not ready for that information, and that speaking about it would put him at risk even inside the protection the American government had provided. After Falcone was killed in a massive road bombing in May 1992, and fellow magistrate Paolo Borsellino was killed in a separate bombing 2 months later, Buscetta changed his position. He named politicians he said had maintained relationships with the organization, including former Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti. Those accusations generated years of legal proceedings in Italy. Buscetta died of cancer on April 2, 2000 in the United States, having spent his final years living under a false identity. He was buried under that same false name. His wife and surviving children remained in hiding for decades after his death, still receiving no public identification out of continued concern for their safety. 11 members of his family had been eliminated by the organization in retaliation for his cooperation. The scale of what Buscetta accomplished in terms of convictions obtained was extraordinary by any measure. But everything covered so far, Valachi, Hill, Gravano, Bulger, Buscetta, involves men who either had limited rank, were associates rather than formal members, or were senior figures who stopped short of the absolute top. The next case is the one that made organized crime figures across America genuinely reconsider whether any position, no matter how high, still carried any protection from the possibility of the person holding it deciding to cooperate. Section 6. Joe Massino. The last Don becomes the last rat. Joseph Massino was born in 1943 in Maspeth, Queens, and left school during his sophomore year of high school. He started with numbers running and loan sharking, caught the attention of Bonanno family acting boss Philip Rastelli in the early 1970s, and was placed on a direct path toward formal membership. He became a made man, moved steadily up through the ranks, and by 1991 had taken over as the official boss of the Bonanno crime family. By the late 1990s, federal prosecutors were calling him the most powerful organized crime boss in the United States. Every other sitting boss of a New York family was either in prison or had been recently released from prison. Massino alone had kept himself clean enough to remain free and operational. The press gave him a nickname, the Last Don, and it was accurate in a literal sense. He was the last one standing. He had stayed free through extraordinary discipline. He shut down all of the Bonanno family's social clubs, which he recognized as easy surveillance targets. He required his captains and soldiers to avoid speaking his name in any context where they could be overheard. If someone needed to reference him in conversation, they were to tug their ear rather than say his name aloud. Family meetings were held in remote locations or, when possible, in other countries entirely, to make electronic surveillance as difficult as possible. On at least one occasion, he conducted sensitive business discussions inside a walk-in refrigerator at a catering business he was connected to, specifically to defeat any listening devices that might have been planted nearby. None of it was enough. Federal investigators had been building a case against Massino for years, working methodically through the Bonanno family structure by flipping lower-ranking members and using their testimony to climb toward the top. By the early 2000s, several Bonanno captains had already agreed to cooperate with the government. Each one who flipped provided information that implicated people above them, which created pressure on those people, which produced further cooperation. The chain worked its way upward. On January 9, 2003, Massino was arrested on a sweeping racketeering indictment that included charges connected to the 1981 elimination of Bonanno captain Dominic Napolitano, who had been held responsible within the family for unwittingly vouching for undercover FBI agent Joseph Pistone during Pistone's 6-year infiltration of the Bonannos in the late 1970s. Massino's underboss and brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale, was arrested alongside him. Vitale, facing serious charges of his own and receiving no meaningful support from Massino, made the decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors in February 2003. His testimony against Massino was damaging. The trial proceeded in the summer of 2004. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury found Massino guilty on all 11 counts he faced. He was looking at life in federal prison with no possibility of release. Then, prosecutors informed him that they were preparing a separate indictment, a capital case, meaning they intended to seek the death penalty. One of John Ashcroft's final acts as Attorney General was formally authorizing federal prosecutors to pursue execution in Massino's case. If convicted on the additional charge, Massino would have faced becoming the first organized crime figure executed by the federal government since Louis Buchalter in 1944. On July 30, 2004, immediately after the verdict was read and before the courtroom had fully cleared, Massino asked to speak privately with the judge. He made his first offer to cooperate right there, hours after conviction. He was the first sitting boss of a New York crime family in the history of American organized crime to take that step. What he then did went beyond simply providing testimony about past crimes. While still in federal custody, Massino agreed to wear a recording device during conversations with Vincent Basciano, who had taken over as acting boss of the Bonanno family on the outside. Those recorded conversations captured Basciano discussing a planned elimination of a federal prosecutor handling organized crime cases in Brooklyn. Massino, the sitting boss of the family, was now actively building new criminal cases against his own successor while both of them were behind bars. Basciano was subsequently charged with additional counts, including conspiracy connected to those recorded conversations. He was eventually sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Massino gave up more than testimony. He surrendered $7 million in cash that had been hidden in the attic of his home and more than 250 gold bars that had been stored there as well. The Brooklyn federal judge who oversaw his cooperation later wrote that Massino was, quite simply, the most important cooperating witness in the modern history of law enforcement's effort to prosecute the American Mafia. In 2013, the same judge released Massino from custody as a direct reward for the scope of his cooperation. He was placed in the Witness Protection Program, given a new identity, and relocated to Ohio. He died there in September 2023 at the age of 80, under a name that was not his own. The pattern running through every case in this episode, Valachi, Hill, Gravano, Bulger, Buscetta, Massino, is that each man made a calculation when the cost of staying loyal exceeded the cost of leaving. But all of those men were reacting to pressure that came from outside. Arrests, charges, sentencing exposure. The next case is different in a way that makes it the darkest story on this list, because the man at the center of it was not reacting to anything the government did. He had been cooperating for 16 straight years before anyone outside the FBI knew his name. And when his identity was finally exposed, he refused every offer of protection and stayed exactly where he was. Section 7. Willie Boy Johnson, the informant who refused to become one. Wilfred Johnson was born in 1935 in Brooklyn, raised in the Canarsie neighborhood, and came from a background that put him permanently outside the rules of formal Mafia membership. His father was part Native American, his mother was Italian American. Under the organization's strict requirements, that mixed heritage meant he could never be made. Like Henry Hill before him, he would always be an associate, useful, trusted to a degree, but excluded from the full protection that formal membership was supposed to provide. He grew up around the same Brooklyn criminal world that produced John Gotti, and the two men became genuinely close over decades of shared criminal activity. Johnson was physically imposing, described by a retired NYPD lieutenant as stocky, around 5 feet 9 inches, well over 200 pounds, built like a professional wrestler, with a size 21 neck and a voice that matched the rest of him. He worked as a crane operator before his criminal career took over, and he brought that physical presence into everything he did for the Gambino family. In 1966, shortly after his release from a prison term, FBI agents approached Johnson and identified an opening. He had shown visible dissatisfaction with the way the Gambino organization had treated him, and the Bureau moved on that. They offered to drop pending counterfeiting charges in exchange for cooperation. Johnson agreed and became a confidential FBI informant. He was 30 years old. He would remain an informant for the next 16 years, without anyone in the Gambino family knowing. His handler was Special Agent Martin Boland, and the relationship between them was unusual by the standards of how the FBI typically managed informant relationships. Johnson did not volunteer information proactively. He answered specific questions when Boland brought them to him, with Boland submitting queries on behalf of multiple FBI organized crime squads and the Drug Enforcement Administration simultaneously. The arrangement was disciplined and carefully managed on both sides. Johnson was also careful about one specific area. He consistently avoided providing detailed information about John Gotti. The two men had been close since childhood, and that relationship created a boundary Johnson would not fully cross. He provided information on other Gambino crews, on the activities of the Lucchese family. In 1978, he told Boland the location of Lucchese captain Paul Vario's hijacking operation, which was running out of a scrapyard in Queens, and on a range of criminal enterprises across multiple families. But Gotti remained a largely protected subject in his conversations with the Bureau. The financial arrangement between Johnson and the FBI was also unusual. He received almost no direct monetary compensation for 16 years of intelligence work. The exception came through insurance company reward programs, when Johnson's information led to the recovery of hijacked goods, and insurance companies offered rewards for that recovery. The FBI provided confidential documentation confirming Johnson's role, and he collected those rewards through that separate channel. In one instance, that amounted to $30,000 for the recovery of a single large shipment. In 1985, everything collapsed. A federal prosecutor named Diane Giacalone was building a racketeering case against John Gotti and several co-defendants, including Johnson himself. In what became a significant source of conflict between Giacalone and the FBI, she disclosed in open court that Johnson had been working as a Bureau informant, specifically as a tactic to pressure him into formally cooperating as a witness against Gotti. The FBI strongly opposed this move, arguing it endangered Johnson and destroyed a valuable intelligence asset. The disagreement caused the Bureau to withdraw from active involvement in the Gotti prosecution entirely. Johnson's handlers urged him to enter the Witness Protection Program immediately. His identity was now public. Every person in the Gambino organization knew what he had been doing for 16 years. The logical outcome of that exposure, inside that world, was not complicated to predict. Johnson refused. He publicly denied ever having been an informant. He refused relocation, refused the new identity, refused every offer the Bureau made to move him out of Brooklyn. He continued to show up in the same neighborhoods, around the same people, living the same life he had always lived, as if the courtroom disclosure had not happened. He maintained that position for 3 years. On August 29, 1988, Johnson walked to his car outside his Brooklyn home in the morning. He was ambushed and shot multiple times. He died at the scene. He was 52 years old. 2 members of the Bonanno crime family were later identified as suspects in his death, though the case was never prosecuted to conviction. Johnson had given the FBI 16 years of intelligence, helped build cases that produced multiple significant arrests, and refused every exit that was offered to him when his position became known. He died on a Brooklyn sidewalk 3 years after his exposure, having never formally testified against anyone. His story raises a question that has no clean answer. Whether the FBI's handling of his exposure, specifically Giacalone's courtroom disclosure, contributed directly to his death by making his continued presence in Brooklyn a problem that the organization felt it had to resolve. That question was never fully examined in any public forum. The cases covered so far all involve men whose cooperation, willing or otherwise, was eventually acknowledged and processed through some formal legal structure. What the next section examines is different, not a single informant, but the institutional machinery that was built to handle all of them. What it costs to run that machinery, and what happens when the people inside it decide the rules no longer apply to them. Section 8. The Witness Protection Program. What happens after the testimony? The Federal Witness Protection Program did not exist before Joseph Valachi sat down in that Senate chamber in 1963. Before his testimony, the government had no formal structure for what to do with someone who had broken the Mafia's code of silence and needed to disappear. Valachi himself was simply moved between federal facilities under heavy guard, eventually settled at a prison in La Tuna, Texas, and kept alive through institutional custody rather than through any systematic program designed to give him a new life. The legal architecture that Valachi's testimony made possible, RICO, court-authorized wiretapping, and eventually the formal witness protection program, was built across the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The Organized Crime Control Act of 1970 created the statutory foundation for the program, and the United States Marshals Service was assigned responsibility for administering it. The core mechanics were straightforward in concept. A cooperating witness who faced credible threat to their life in exchange for their testimony would be given a new legal identity, relocated to a different part of the country, provided with housing assistance and a subsistence payment during the transition period, and supported in finding legitimate employment under their new name. By the time the program had been running for a decade, it had processed hundreds of individuals. The majority were not organized crime figures. The program covered witnesses across all categories of federal prosecution. But the Mafia cases were the highest profile, and they produced the most complicated outcomes. Because the people being protected were not innocent bystanders who had witnessed a crime. They were, in most cases, career criminals who had committed serious offenses themselves and whose cooperation was valuable precisely because of how deeply embedded they had been in the organizations being prosecuted. Henry Hill entered the program in 1980 with his wife Karen and their 2 children. The family was relocated under new identities to an undisclosed location and moved multiple times over the following years as Hill's behavior created security concerns. Hill could not stop being Henry Hill. He continued using narcotics, continued drawing attention to himself, continued making contact with people from his previous life. The Marshals Service removed him from the program in 1987, 7 years after he entered it. His wife Karen divorced him in 1989, 1 year before the release of Goodfellas made his story internationally famous. He spent the remaining 25 years of his life appearing publicly under his own name, selling his story through books, television appearances, and eventually a cooking brand built around his identity as a former mobster. He died in 2012. Sammy Gravano's experience with the program followed a different trajectory and ended more dramatically. He entered after his 1992 cooperation and was relocated to Arizona with his family under new identities. For several years, the arrangement held. Then, Gravano reconnected with criminal activity. By the late 1990s, he had built a distribution network for the synthetic drug ecstasy in the Phoenix area. The operation involved his son, his daughter, and his ex-wife, alongside dozens of other participants. It was generating substantial revenue weekly before law enforcement dismantled it in February 2000. The investigation that brought Gravano down used informants inside his own network, people who cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced consequences, the exact same mechanism Gravano had used against Gotti 8 years earlier. He pleaded guilty in 2001 and served nearly 2 decades in Arizona State Prison before his release in 2017. Joseph Massino's exit from the program was the most structured of the major organized crime cases. After his 2013 release from federal custody, he was placed in the program, given a new identity, and relocated to Ohio. He lived there quietly until his death in September 2023. The judge who authorized his release noted that the scope of his cooperation had been exceptional by any standard the court had encountered. The program's overall record across its history is significant in numerical terms. By the time it had been running for several decades, The Marshals Service reported that no individual who followed the program's security requirements had been harmed while under its active protection. The qualifier in that sentence matters. Following the program's requirements. Hill did not follow them. Gravano did not follow them. Both experienced serious consequences, though of different kinds. The program costs money to operate. Witnesses receive payments during their transition period. Legal documents need to be created and maintained across multiple government systems. Relocation costs are covered. Over the life of the program, the financial investment has been substantial, though the government does not publish detailed operational budgets for it, given the obvious security implications. What the program cannot do is change who a person is. It can move someone to Nebraska and give them a new driver's license. It cannot give them new instincts, new habits, or a genuine interest in living within legal boundaries after decades of doing the opposite. The institutional story of how America built and ran this machinery connects directly to the broader question of what the FBI was willing to tolerate in exchange for the intelligence that made it work. That question has no more concentrated example than the case that follows. An organized crime figure operating out of Boston who was not just protected by his FBI handler, but actively armed with information that he used to eliminate potential threats, while the Bureau's own institutional incentive structure made challenging that arrangement career-limiting for anyone who tried. Section 9. The FBI's informant culture. When the system corrupts itself. The FBI did not stumble accidentally into the problems that the Bulger case exposed. Those problems grew directly out of a deliberate institutional policy that the Bureau had built and promoted across the 1970s and into the 1980s. A policy designed to penetrate organized crime at the highest possible levels by developing what the FBI formally categorized as top echelon criminal informants. The concept was straightforward. Low-level arrests and prosecutions were producing convictions, but they were not dismantling the organizations themselves. The families simply replaced whoever went to prison and continued operating. To actually break the structure, the FBI needed intelligence from inside the leadership tier, from captains, underbosses, and bosses rather than from street-level soldiers. The top echelon program was built to develop exactly those sources. The problem was in how the Bureau measured success. An agent's career advancement within the organized crime division depended in significant part on how many top echelon informants that agent had developed and maintained. Agents who cultivated high-level sources received commendations, promotions, and recognition within the Bureau. The metric being tracked was the quality and seniority of the informant, not the ongoing criminal behavior of that informant during the period they were being handled. John Connolly received 8 formal commendations from FBI directors across his career, starting with J. Edgar Hoover. He was regarded within the Boston field office as one of the most effective organized crime agents in the division, specifically because of his relationship with Bulger and Flemmi. The cases he built against the Patriarca family and against Gennaro Angiulo, the Boston underboss of the New England organization, were real and significant. Angiulo was arrested in 1983, and the prosecutions that followed were legitimate. The intelligence Connolly was delivering was producing results that his supervisors valued and rewarded. What those supervisors were not examining carefully enough was the other side of the ledger. While Connolly was delivering Patriarca family intelligence, Bulger was using the protection Connolly provided to build his own criminal operation to a scale it could not have reached without that protection. The Winter Hill Gang expanded into narcotics distribution, which Bulger had previously avoided. It eliminated rivals with a confidence that came directly from knowing the FBI would not be building cases against the Winter Hill leadership, and it received the identities of individuals cooperating with law enforcement against Bulger, which Connolly supplied and which produced fatal consequences for those individuals. Tom Foley, the Massachusetts State Police commander who spent years trying to build cases against Bulger while watching federal investigations repeatedly fail to touch him, described the dynamic with precision in later interviews. He said that Bulger was sharing information specifically when he wanted to remove competition, and that the FBI could not or would not see that the intelligence was being curated to serve Bulger's interests rather than the Bureau's. Foley also noted that Connolly was not operating in total isolation. Other supervisors in the Boston field office and in Washington were aware of the broad outlines of what the Bulger relationship involved. Connolly's direct supervisor, John Morris, was compromised as well. Morris accepted money from Bulger and Flemmi on multiple occasions. He allowed Bulger to purchase airline tickets for Morris's girlfriend. By the early 1980s, Morris was, in the assessment of later investigators, thoroughly compromised. In 1988, apparently calculating that self-disclosure was safer than being exposed by someone else, Morris gave an off-the-record interview to the Boston Globe, in which he disclosed the existence of the FBI's protection arrangement with Bulger. He was later granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying against Connolly. The United States attorney who prosecuted Connolly put the situation in a single sentence that has been quoted repeatedly since. He said that John Connolly had become a Winter Hill Gang operative who was masquerading as an FBI agent. Connolly's defense, which he maintained publicly for years after his conviction, was that the trade was worth it. His argument was that the Bureau had dismantled the New England Italian-American organized crime structure, a genuine and significant accomplishment, and that the price paid in terms of what Bulger was permitted to do during the same period was an acceptable operational cost. He asked, in a Boston Globe interview, to find a businessman who would not make that trade given the return on investment. The families of the people who died as a result of information Connolly passed to Bulger did not find that argument persuasive. The structural reforms the FBI implemented after the Bulger case became public included stricter documentation requirements for informant relationships, mandatory supervisory review of active handlers, and clearer guidelines about the boundaries of permissible protection. Whether those reforms were sufficient has been debated by law enforcement professionals and legal scholars since their implementation. What the Connolly case made undeniable was something that anyone who thought carefully about the top echelon program's incentive structure could have identified long before Bulger disappeared in 1994. When an institution rewards agents for developing high-level criminal sources without equally rigorous accountability for what those sources are doing during the period they are being handled, the conditions for exactly this kind of corruption are not just possible, they are predictable. Every case in this episode has involved a man who made a decision to cooperate with the government and received something in return. The final section pulls back from the individual stories and examines what all of them together permanently did to the institution they betrayed, and whether what replaced omertà inside the American Mafia is more dangerous or less dangerous than what came before it. Section 10. The Omertà Collapse. What happened to the Code of Silence? Omertà was never a romantic tradition. It was not primarily about honor or brotherhood in any meaningful sense. It was a practical mechanism, the single most important structural feature that made the American Mafia legally untouchable for decades. Without witnesses willing to testify, prosecutors could not build cases. Without cases, there were no convictions. Without convictions, the organization continued operating regardless of what law enforcement knew or suspected. The Code of Silence was not a cultural artifact. It was the immune system of a criminal enterprise, and it functioned effectively for a very long time. Joseph Valachi cracked it in 1963. What followed across the next 4 decades was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion. Each major cooperation producing conditions that made the next one more likely, until the cumulative effect had permanently altered the operational reality of organized crime in America. The mechanism that drove the erosion was not courage or conscience in most cases. It was mathematics. Federal sentencing under RICO carried exposure that previous generations of organized crime figures had never faced. A conviction on a broad racketeering indictment could mean life in federal prison. The Witness Protection Program, created partly as a direct result of Valachi's testimony, meant that cooperation came with a survivable exit. Not a comfortable one, not a permanent one in many cases, but a survivable one. The calculation that each cooperating witness made was not fundamentally different from the calculation any person makes when the cost of one option becomes clearly higher than the cost of another. Valachi's testimony in 1963 produced no direct prosecutions of sitting mafia bosses. His value was informational rather than immediately prosecutorial. He gave the government the map, and the government spent the next 2 decades building the legal tools to use it. The RICO Act passed in 1970. The first major RICO prosecutions against organized crime leadership came in the early 1980s. By 1985, federal prosecutors had indicted the bosses of all 5 New York families simultaneously in what became known as the Commission case, using evidence that drew directly on the legal framework Valachi's testimony had made possible. From 1981 to 1987 alone, more than 1,000 Mafia members and associates were convicted following FBI investigations, dismantling the leadership hierarchies of crime families in New York, Boston, Cleveland, Denver, Kansas City, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and New Jersey. That wave of convictions did not happen because law enforcement suddenly became more competent. It happened because the legal tools built in response to Valachi finally matured, and because each conviction created new pressure on the people who remained free. Henry Hill's cooperation in 1980 produced 50 convictions. Gravano's cooperation in 1991 produced convictions against Gotti and eventually aided cases against more than 36 other organized crime figures, including the boss of the Genovese family and the boss of the Colombo family. Massino's cooperation, starting in 2004, assisted in convictions against more than 90 Bonanno family members and associates. Buscetta's testimony across Italy and America contributed to 338 convictions in the Maxi trial alone, plus the 18 convictions in the Pizza Connection case. The cumulative arithmetic of those numbers across 40 years represented the effective dismantling of the organizational structures that had made the American and Sicilian mafias the dominant criminal forces of the 20th century. What replaced omertà inside the surviving organizations was not a stronger version of the code. It was pervasive suspicion. When Massino required his soldiers to tug their ears rather than speak his name, that was not a security innovation born from confidence in his organization's loyalty. It was a symptom of an institution that no longer trusted its own members to hold their silence under legal pressure. When Gotti referred to the Bonanno family dismissively after the Donnie Brasco infiltration was exposed, refusing to allow them a seat on the commission for a period, that too was a symptom. An acknowledgement that any family could be penetrated, that any member could potentially become a source. The surviving American organized crime families of the 2020s operate at a fraction of the power and reach they held in the 1970s. They still exist. They still generate criminal revenue. They still maintain enough internal discipline to conduct operations. But the federal government's own organized crime analysts have consistently described the current state of the traditional Italian-American mafia as significantly diminished compared to its peak, smaller in membership, reduced in political influence, and far more exposed to law enforcement penetration than at any previous point in the organization's American history. That diminishment was not primarily the result of law enforcement becoming more sophisticated, though it did. It was not primarily the result of better legal tools, though those helped enormously. It was the result of the organization's own members deciding, one after another across 4 decades, that the promise of omertà was no longer a promise the organization could keep. Once Valachi said the words out loud in 1963 and survived long enough to die of a heart attack in a Texas prison 8 years later, the calculation was permanently changed for everyone who came after him. The code held as long as breaking it guaranteed a worse outcome than keeping it. When the mathematics shifted, when federal sentencing exposure, witness protection, and the demonstrated survival of previous cooperators made cooperation a rational option rather than a certain death sentence, the code began to fail. Not for everyone. Willie Boy Johnson refused the exit and paid the price. But for enough people, enough times, across enough decades, that the institution built on that code never fully recovered. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.